Australia did something in World War II that terrified myths couldn't survive. In the mud and rain of Milne Bay, Australian soldiers, many of them mocked as part-timers, went up against Japan's feared ground troops. And history should have exploded, but instead, the story went quiet. So let me ask you this. Why don't more people know the moment Australians proved the invincible Japanese infantry could be beaten decisively? Who started whispering doubts to Washington while Australians were bleeding in the jungle? And after the fight, who managed the credit and why? If you think you know the Pacific War, stay with me until the end, because the details behind what happened to Australia's victory at Milne Bay are the part that will shock you. The 14th day arrived like a verdict, and Milne Bay looked like the world's dirtiest courtroom. The jungle was still smoldering, the air was thick, and the coastline of Papua New Guinea had turned into a slick ribbon of mud and wreckage. Oh, Japanese soldiers lay scattered along that shoreline, abandoned, cut off, and finished. And then the line that should have been impossible became true. For the first time in the entire Second World War, a Japanese land force was not merely slowed or stopped, it was decisively beaten and thrown back into the sea. The men who did it were Australian, and that detail matters more than most history books ever admit. They were not a neat parade of professionals, not the kind of soldiers Hollywood loves to photograph. Many were militia, part-time defenders, the kind of men polite society quietly underestimates until the moment they are needed most. Against every prediction, those Australians broke Japan's supposedly unstoppable land drive across the Pacific right there in that forgotten tropical corner. They had been dismissed as soft, dismissed as second-rate, dismissed as a gamble that would collapse under pressure. They had been doubted in Washington and sneered at in Brisbane, even while they were the ones expected to hold the line. Yet at Milne Bay, they did not fold, they did not drift backward, and they did not allow the story to end the way the powerful had already written it. The establishment had looked at them and seen a weakness, but the jungle saw something else entirely. But that was only the first blow, because the moment the fighting ended, the silence began. The next battle was not fought with rifles or tanks. It was fought in offices and cables and carefully chosen words, and in the deliberate refusal to say one simple sentence out loud. The world would not hear about Milne Bay the way it deserved, not then and not for decades. The victory should have thundered across headlines because it shattered the myth that Japanese land troops could not be beaten. Instead, it arrived like a muffled announcement, then faded into a polite footnote, as if history itself had been told to lower its voice. For Australians who fought and bled in that jungle, it became a bitterly familiar kind of triumph. The win you are allowed to have, but not allowed to own. This is where the story turns nasty, because it was not a misunderstanding and it was not bad luck. The record did not disappear, the facts did not vanish, and the achievement was not ambiguous. The recognition simply failed to arrive at full volume. And you do not need a conspiracy theory to understand how that happens. It happens when a powerful man is embarrassed by reality and decides reality needs editing. It happens when the truth is inconvenient to a reputation, and reputation has a headquarters, a press machine, and a direct line to Washington. It happens when the people who actually did the job are far away, muddy, exhausted, and politically powerless. But this was only the second blow, because the silence had a face and it had a uniform. The man shaping the narrative was not a distant bureaucrat, but the most dominant Allied figure in the region, and the paper trail he left behind is the kind that makes you stare at a page and ask, how did this ever become acceptable? General Douglas MacArthur commanded the entire Allied force in the Pacific, and he was watching Milne Bay with growing anxiety. While Australian soldiers were fighting, holding, and bleeding in the jungle, MacArthur was telling Washington the Australians were failing, that they were not performing. The historical record preserves his phrasing cited by the Australian War Memorial. He described Milne Bay as the first test of Australian troops under my command, and made clear he was not confident they would pass it. That's not just commentary, it is positioning, because those words travel upward and harden into policy. MacArthur had his own narrative to protect. He had arrived in Australia in March of 1942 after leaving his besieged command in the Philippines, a departure that was controversial even if Washington dressed it up as strategic necessity. He needed the story of the Pacific to show that under his command the Allies could fight and win. And in the first days of Milne Bay, he did not see reassurance, he saw risk. So he planted doubt while the outcome was still uncertain, and that is where the moral ugliness begins. Doubts were seated at the highest levels of Allied command about the quality of the men in the jungle, while those men were meeting Japanese troops and Japanese tanks in conditions that would have tested any army on Earth. The Australians were being judged in real time by people who were not there, and those judgments were being filed like insurance policies. If the line broke, the paperwork would already explain why, but the test did not go the way MacArthur feared. When the Australians not only passed but shattered it, MacArthur did not correct the record. He did not stand before cameras and say he had been wrong. He did not give the men of Milne Bay the public recognition their achievement demanded, and he did not restore the credit his own cables had already begun to distort. Instead, the narrative was managed and the spotlight was shifted, and the story was allowed to fade. But this was only the third blow, because once you understand what the world believed about Japan in the summer of 1942, Milne Bay stops looking like a battle and starts looking like a rupture. That myth of Japanese invincibility was not a newspaper slogan, it was a strategic paralysis. It changed how commanders planned, how soldiers feared, and how nations talked themselves into surrender before a shot was fired. By August of 1942, Japan had achieved something military historians had never seen before, not at that speed and scale. In less than 6 months, Japan had seized Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and vast stretches of the Pacific. British fortresses that were supposed to hold for years collapsed in days, and American forces were pushed back, surrounded, and captured in humiliating numbers. The fall of Singapore alone sent shockwaves through the Allied world. More than 100,000 Allied soldiers surrendered there to a Japanese force roughly half their size, and that statistic spread like poison through every Allied headquarters. It was not only defeat, it was humiliation, and humiliation breeds myths faster than propaganda ever could. The idea took hold that Japanese soldiers did not retreat, did not surrender, and did not fail. Allied commanders genuinely believed it. Experienced officers filed reports describing the enemy as almost superhuman in endurance, aggression, and tactical skill, and those reports shaped everything. They shaped deployments, strategic calculations, and the conversations between generals about whether their own men were even capable of fighting back. Australia was no exception to that fear, and Milne Bay was the place where fear was forced to meet facts. But this was only the fourth blow, because the men at Milne Bay were not fighting just an enemy in the jungle. They were fighting a myth that had already conquered rooms full of senior officers, the kind of assumption that gets soldiers written off as not good enough by people who have never watched the rain turn a track into a river of mud. Australia in those months had fresh scars that made the fear feel justified. The catastrophic fall of Singapore in February of 1942 had put more than 15,000 Australian soldiers into captivity, the largest mass capture of Australian military personnel in the nation's history. Those men faced years of imprisonment under conditions that ranged from brutal to lethal, and that shadow sat over the country like smoke. After Greece and Crete in 1941, after retreats and losses that felt like being thrown into fights already lost before they began, Australians had every reason to wonder who would stand with them and who would write them off again. So when Milne Bay happened, it was not just another engagement, and that is the part the silence tried to steal. It was the moment a supposedly unstoppable Japanese land advance was broken by Australians who had been dismissed even by their allies. It was the moment the militiamen, mocked as Chocos, proved they did not melt under heat, mud, fear, or pressure. And it was the moment that should have rewritten the Pacific story in bold print, if bold print had been allowed. Now ask yourself the uncomfortable question the official story avoided. If Australians delivered the first decisive land defeat of a Japanese force in the war, why did the world not hear it at full blast? Why did the cables of doubt travel faster than the news of victory? Why did a commander who questioned Australian performance keep his doubts on the record, but keep his correction off it? The answers sit in the clash between battlefield truth and headquarters vanity, and Milne Bay is where that clash gets exposed. Milne Bay was not a romantic name, and it was not a famous place, but in the middle of 1942, it was a loaded gun aimed at the entire Southwest Pacific. and it sat on the eastern tip of New Guinea, a deep natural harbor wrapped in dense jungle, steep mountains, and rain that felt endless. The air was wet, the ground was heavy, and the vegetation closed in so tight that even daylight could look trapped. And in that oppressive green bowl, Allied engineers were carving airstrips out of mud because whoever owned those runways would own the sky over a huge slice of ocean, control Milne Bay, and you control air access across the region. Control those airstrips, and you can push aircraft forward, strike shipping lanes, and choke the enemy's movement long before he reaches Port Moresby. Lose those airstrips, and the enemy gains a forward base that turns every nearby Allied position into a target, every supply run into a gamble, and every defensive plan into a desperate improvisation. This was not a random brawl in the jungle. It was a strategic hinge with the weight of Australia's northern lifeline on it. But here is the part that makes Milne Bay feel like a trap laid by geography itself. The place was a nightmare for anyone who thought war ran on clean maps. Milne Bay's harbor looked like a gift to planners, and that is exactly why it became a prize. A deep anchorage meant ships could arrive with men and supplies, and airstrips meant fighters and bombers could operate close to the front line. Every staff officer who understood air power could see the chain reaction because airfields in the wrong hands would tilt the entire campaign across New Guinea. Japanese planners understood it too, and they did not come to admire the scenery. Their plan carried a code name, Operation RE, and it was coldly simple: land, seize the airstrip, smash the Allied garrison, and convert Milne Bay into a forward base for the push toward Port Moresby and the pressure on Australia itself. It was meant to be quick, efficient, and demoralizing, the kind of operation that makes defenders feel small and attackers feel unstoppable. In Japanese planning rooms, Milne Bay was a stepping stone, not a graveyard, but this was only the opening blow because Japanese planners were about to walk into something they did not fully appreciate. The force waiting at Milne Bay was not a single neat unit with one tidy identity, and that complexity mattered. The Allied garrison, known as Milne Force, was a combined command shaped around two main Australian formations that carried very different reputations. One was the 18th Brigade of the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, regular soldiers with the hard edge of earlier campaigns and service in the Middle East. The other was the 7th Brigade, and this is where the story turns sharp because the 7th was composed largely of militia. Militia meant part-time citizen soldiers, men who had enlisted for the defense of Australia rather than overseas service. They were farmers who had left paddocks, factory workers who had left shifts, teachers who had left classrooms, tradesmen who had put down tools and picked up rifles, and they arrived in uniform carrying the quiet, ordinary stubbornness of people who did not join to make speeches but to hold ground, and instead of respect, they were handed a sneer. In official circles, in the messes of high command, even in the corridors of powerful headquarters in Brisbane, these militiamen were called, quote, too, quote, short for, quote, three, quote. The implication was not subtle, and it was not kind. Soldiers who would melt under heat, pressure, and fear. It was a label designed to shrink them before combat even began. A social stamp that said, you are lesser, even while you are being asked to stand in front of the enemy. But here is the uncomfortable question Milne Bay forces onto the table. What kind of system insults the men it is counting on to survive? The insult carried class, culture, and institutional arrogance, and it poisoned the atmosphere behind the lines. The 2nd Australian Imperial Force was treated as the real army, while militia were treated like a temporary substitute, useful only until proper soldiers arrived. That mindset was easy to maintain in offices and easy to repeat in bars, but it collapsed fast when real pressure arrived at the perimeter. Because the 18th Brigade brought experience and credibility, and it mattered in a hard campaign. The 7th Brigade brought numbers, local defensive purpose, and men who were fighting for home soil in the most literal sense. Together they formed the spine of a garrison that was not waiting to be rescued, because there was no easy rescue in that part of the world in 1942, but this was only the second blow because the enemy arrived at night, and he arrived convinced the job would be easy. Late in the night of the 25th of August, 1942, Japanese landing craft came ashore at the eastern end of Milne Bay. It was not a token raid, and it was not a probe. The planners sent an experienced unit and backed it with tanks. The first time the Allies in the Pacific would face Japanese armor in a land engagement. Steel tracks and jungle mud have a way of turning rumors into panic, especially when the enemy has been considered invincible for months. The original landing party numbered roughly 1,200 men, with reinforcements expected to follow. The plan assumed speed, because speed was Japan's favorite weapon in that phase of the war. Japanese commanders expected to seize those runways within days at most. They had been told the opposition would be light. They had been told the airstrips were not yet operational. They had been given bad intelligence. And in war, bad intelligence is not a clerical error. It is a direct pipeline to catastrophe. But here is the twist that changes everything. The enemy thought he was stepping onto a soft target, and he stepped instead onto a loaded spring. The presence of tanks was meant to feel like a statement, a threat designed to crush confidence and force retreat before the real fighting began. Yet Milne Bay was not built for clean armored maneuver. Japanese tanks were not arriving onto a wide European plain. They were arriving into a wet, tight environment where every movement could be slowed and every plan strangled by mud and jungle. Instead of a neat run to the airstrips, the attackers found confusion, poor visibility, and a battlefield that punished every assumption made in a distant planning room. But this was only the third blow, because the label "chocolate soldiers" was about to be dragged out of the barracks and thrown into the mud where it belonged. Those militiamen were not a footnote in the defense. They were part of the core that absorbed the hardest early pressure. The word Chocos implied weakness, but Milne Bay demanded endurance, and endurance is not issued by headquarters. It is revealed under stress. These were not men built for parade grounds, and that turned out to be an advantage because Milne Bay was a place where survival mattered more than shine. The only discipline that counted was functional discipline, the kind that keeps a line intact when the jungle goes quiet and the enemy is somewhere close in the dark. So the stage was set with brutal clarity. A wet harbor and fragile airstrips on the eastern tip of New Guinea had become the hinge point of a theater. A combined Australian force, divided by reputation and insult, was forced to stand together. And an enemy that had landed on the 25th of August, 1942, backed by tanks and absolute confidence, was about to learn what happens when intelligence lies and defenders refuse to play their assigned role. Do not mistake this for a simple clash of units, because Milne Bay was about to prove that the most dangerous weapon in war is not a tank, not a rifle, not even an airstrip. The most dangerous weapon is a myth, and Milne Bay was built to smash myths into pieces. The first shots did not echo like they do in clean country, because Milne Bay swallowed sound the way it swallowed boots. The green walls pressed in tight, the rain came down like a punishment, and visibility collapsed until a man could barely see beyond a few meters of dripping leaves. This was not a battlefield that rewarded neat formations or elegant plans, because the jungle turned every movement into a slow, filthy argument with mud. In that close, wet darkness, the war stopped being a grand campaign and became something primitive, direct, and vicious. The Japanese force pushed forward with the same aggressive confidence that had terrified Allied commanders across the Pacific. Tracks became channels of brown water, open patches became killing grounds, and every tree line looked like a trap. The Australian defenders did not get the luxury of long sight lines or safe distance because contact came suddenly, and at ranges where training ends and nerve begins. In Milne Bay, the jungle did not allow small mistakes. It punished every slip with immediate consequences. Every meter of muddy track was contested, and that phrase is not poetry, it is arithmetic. Every fallen tree became a barricade, every creek crossing became a choke point, and every stretch of open ground demanded a price. Men moved by feel, by sound, by instinct, and by the strictest kind of battlefield discipline, the kind that exists without ceremony and without applause. But here is the part people miss when they imagine numbers on paper. Milne Bay did not fight like a normal battle, and it did not care what anyone's timetable said. The 7th Brigade Militia found themselves in savage close quarters, fighting against battle-hardened Japanese troops, exactly the kind of matchup experts said would break them. The terrain stripped away the advantages of organized strength and reduced combat to its most basic form. This was not a place where you could dominate with shiny equipment, because the jungle made the best weapon the one you could still carry through knee-deep muck. It was a grinding clash where the line between holding and collapsing was thin and under permanent pressure. The psychological weight was crushing because the enemy carried a reputation that felt almost supernatural in 1942. Japanese infantry had been described as unstoppable, disciplined beyond Western standards, and terrifyingly aggressive, and those claims had already seeped into Allied thinking at every level. At Milne Bay, those claims arrived in the form of real men moving forward in real rain. The Australians had to answer them without the comfort of distance, without the reassurance of reinforcements, and without anyone in power publicly backing them. They answered the only way possible by refusing to give ground that mattered. The conditions were so punishing that victory could not be won quickly. It had to be survived minute by minute, hour by hour, in a jungle that was indifferent to which side it drowned. But that was only the first blow, because while Australians were fighting for their lives in that mud, another fight was unfolding far away on clean paper with clean hands. Several hundred kilometers away in Brisbane, General Douglas MacArthur watched the battle with growing anxiety. He was the supreme commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, the American general placed in authority over Australian forces in their own country, and he understood that his reputation was tied directly to results. He had arrived in Australia in March of 1942 after leaving his besieged command in the Philippines, under circumstances that carried deep controversy, even after Washington dressed the departure as strategic necessity. He needed the story of the Pacific to confirm his own centralized vision of command, and the fight at Milne Bay was not cooperating. MacArthur was a man of extraordinary ego and extraordinary strategic talent in almost equal measure, and that combination makes a headquarters dangerous. He wanted proof that under his command, the Allied forces could fight and win, delivered cleanly and on schedule. What he got instead was a hard, grinding jungle battle with an uncertain early phase, and uncertainty is poison to a commander who needs to control the narrative before the result is in. Around the fifth day of fighting, MacArthur communicated his concerns to General George Marshall in Washington. The historical record preserves his exact framing, cited by the Australian War Memorial. He described Milne Bay as the _8_ and made clear he was not confident they would pass it. That sentence did not stay in Brisbane. It traveled upward into the highest levels of Allied command and planted institutional doubt, while the men being doubted were still holding the line in the mud. They were being measured, judged, and quietly written off by people who were not there, had never been there, and would never smell that particular combination of rain and cordite and fear. But here is the ugly trick of power in wartime. You can prepare your excuse before the result arrives, and you can call it strategic assessment. MacArthur's cables did not celebrate endurance. They framed Australian capability as a question mark. He was laying the groundwork for a pre-written story that would protect him if the front line buckled, a cold habit of command deployed while militiamen were facing a fight that would have tested any force on Earth. Staff officers later described the atmosphere inside his headquarters as swinging wildly with every incoming report. One officer's description became permanently embedded in Australian military memory. Headquarters was running _10_. That single line captures the contrast with brutal precision. Panic above, pressure below, and a widening gap between the men doing the fighting and the men writing the interpretation. MacArthur needed results, but he needed his version of results even more. He needed the Pacific to look like a story of competent command under his leadership, not a story of Australian soldiers improvising, enduring, and proving reputations wrong without his guidance at the center. And that political front had already opened while the outcome was still in doubt, because in a powerful headquarters, first impressions can outlive facts. But that was only the second blow, because the battlefield itself was about to spring the surprise Japan never planned for, and it came from the very airstrips they assumed were useless. One of the defining factors of the Battle of Milne Bay was Australian air power, and it hit the Japanese operation like a hammer finding a crack. The Royal Australian Air Force's 75th and 77th Squadrons, flying Kitty Hawk fighters and fighter bombers, operated from the very airstrips the Japanese were trying to seize. Day after day, in weather that made flying genuinely dangerous, those pilots flew ground attack missions that tore at the Japanese landing force's ability to move, resupply, and reinforce. This was not glamorous air war. It was close, brutal, precise work, and it changed the arithmetic of the battle. The Kitty Hawk was not the fastest machine in the Allied inventory, and it carried no movie star reputation. It was a workhorse, and in the hands of Australian pilots who knew the ground below them and flew with the focused aggression of men defending their own territory, it became devastatingly effective. The strikes punished troops in the open, hit supply lines, and made every Japanese attempt to consolidate feel like an invitation to be cut apart from above. Now for the detail that turns hard fighting into strategic humiliation. Japan did not plan for any of this. Their intelligence told them the Milne Bay airstrips were not yet operational, and that assumption sat at the center of their entire timetable. That intelligence was wrong, and wrong intelligence in an amphibious landing is not a clerical error. It is a disaster waiting for the tide to go out. The airstrips were operational. The aircraft were fueled and armed. The RAAF pilots were ready. Japan came to seize the sky, and instead the sky started hunting them. Every successful air sortie multiplied the pressure on the ground. A landing force depends on supply, confidence, and momentum, and sustained air attack bleeds all three simultaneously. The Japanese had expected to capture the runways quickly and use them as tools. Instead, those same runways became active weapons turned against them. In the tight, wet geography of Milne Bay, where ground movement already struggled against mud and jungle, airstrikes made every exposed moment feel fatal to the operation. The effect was not only physical, it was psychological. A force that enters expecting light resistance responds differently than a force that realizes it has walked into an organized defense with an air arm that strikes repeatedly and accurately. Confidence corrodes fast when supply lines look vulnerable, when reinforcements feel risky, and when the enemy has not behaved the way the planning room promised. Milne Bay forced the attacker to fight for each small gain while being punished from above, and that is how momentum stops and never starts again. So the grinding hell on the ground and the cold tension in Brisbane were tied together by the same brutal truth. Australians in the mud were doing the work that would decide the battle, while Australians in the air were cutting the enemy's legs out from under him. And in the distance, a powerful headquarters was watching, worrying and carefully shaping words for Washington, because reputations were also on the line, and reputations are easier to manage than jungles. But do not blink now, because once those Kitty Hawks started biting and the jungle kept grinding, the battle stopped being a neat operation and became a slow, public failure for anyone who had promised easy victory. By the first week of September, the Japanese position at Milne Bay was collapsing in real time, and everyone on the ground could feel it. The landing force had failed to seize the airstrips, its momentum had bled out into the mud, and the jungle had turned every forward step into punishment. Australian ground troops and constant air attacks had ground the attackers down until holding stopped being an option, and getting out became the only plan left. This was no dramatic retreat with banners, because Milne Bay offered only darkness, rain, and the hard arithmetic of a failed operation, but that was only the opening act of what came next. On the 4th of September, Japanese commanders made the decision that would mark the war forever: evacuation. Between the 4th and the 7th of September, Japanese destroyers slipped in under cover of night to pull out what remained of the landing force. Men who could not be moved were left behind, and the bay kept what the timetable had promised Japan would own. It was the 14th day of a battle that had never been supposed to happen, and it ended with Japan withdrawing from ground it had come to seize permanently. That single fact carried a shockwave bigger than any headline at the time. Since December of 1941, Japan's land advance had rolled forward with an aura of inevitability, as if the Pacific itself was being cleared for them. At Milne Bay, for the first time in the war, a Japanese force sent to take territory was forced to abandon that territory and pull back. It was not because of overwhelming American mass, and it was not because Australia had endless resources. The real story was simpler and more humiliating for the myth-makers. Australian soldiers refused to move. Regulars and militia held together, stayed in the fight, and turned the landing into a trap the Japanese could not escape without admitting defeat. The Australian War Memorial would later state it without hedging: Milne Bay was Japan's first decisive land defeat of the Second World War. In the Pacific, where fear of Japanese infantry had shaped every Allied plan and poisoned every calculation, that sentence should have been treated like a turning key in a locked door, but here is the cut that never fully healed. Because Milne Bay did more than change the map, it changed the mind. Brigadier John Field, commanding on the ground, put the psychological meaning into one blunt line that cut through months of dread. Our troops have proved that Jap is not a Superman, he said, and in 1942 that was not just an opinion, it was medicine for an alliance drowning in its own fear. That line should have been repeated across every Allied headquarters like an antidote. It should have reached every soldier taught, directly or indirectly, that Japanese soldiers could not be stopped in close country. It should have reached every general still factoring invincibility into his deployments, because the myth had been shaping plans and eroding confidence since Singapore fell. Milne Bay offered proof, not hope, and proof is what changes wars. Instead, the victory's meaning arrived muffled, as if someone had thrown a blanket over the loudest fact in the Pacific. The men who had done the job were still soaked, exhausted, and battered, while the people who controlled the story were dry, connected, and already moving on to the next narrative. Milne Bay should have been a trumpet blast. It was handled like a minor bulletin. And that gap between reality and recognition is where the real scandal breathes. And then came the knives. After the Japanese evacuation, General Douglas MacArthur and General Thomas Blamey turned their critical attention onto Brigadier Cyril Close, the Australian officer who had commanded Milne Force during the battle. They criticized Close for what they labeled _8_, framing his early caution as a flaw rather than the steady control that kept the position intact under severe pressure. That criticism filtered into official assessments and damaged Close's standing in ways the later historical record does not support in any meaningful sense. It was a brutal inversion of what armies claim to reward. A commander holds a key position, absorbs a shock landing backed by tanks, survives the uncertainty of the opening phase, and ends with the enemy evacuating under darkness. Yet the official paperwork focused on alleged hesitation rather than on the result. The Australian War Memorial's account makes clear the criticism was unfair, and it points toward a motive that has nothing to do with jungle tactics and everything to do with protecting a prior prediction. If a powerful commander had planted doubts about Australian performance before the battle and success arrives anyway, the easiest way to preserve the earlier narrative is to attack the shape of the victory. And the atmosphere around headquarters during those days confirms exactly what kind of pressure was driving those judgments. Staff officers described the general headquarters mood as extreme tension swinging wildly with every report from the front. One officer's phrase became a dark classic in Australian military circles. Headquarters was running like a bloody barometer in a cyclone, up and down every 2 minutes. That line is not merely colorful, it is diagnostic, because it shows institutional panic above while men in the mud were quietly doing what needed to be done below. But the damage did not stop with Close. The real cost of this behavior was not only personal, it was national. Milne Bay should have been a clean, proud proof of Australian fighting quality, especially for the militia who had been mocked as Chocos and expected to melt at the first serious contact. Instead, the victory was allowed to drift into the shadows while other campaigns took the public spotlight. The men who carried the early pressure and held the line did not receive the recognition their achievement demanded. The result was a familiar and bitter pattern. Australians do the grinding work, and someone else writes the tidy story. This is where memory becomes part of the battlefield itself. The Pacific War did not stop after Milne Bay, and Australia was pulled through 3 more years of brutal fighting across New Guinea and beyond. Kokoda grew into a national symbol with a weight that felt like a Pacific echo of Gallipoli because its suffering and endurance welded itself into Australia's public imagination with a force that was fully earned. But Milne Bay, even though it was strategically decisive in ways that Kokoda was not in the same sense, receded, not because it lacked meaning, and not because it lacked courage, but because public narrative does not always follow military logic. When the loudest voices in the theater have reasons to avoid a certain story, silence becomes policy without anyone ever announcing it. And the numbers from Milne Bay make that silence harder to justify, not easier. At the peak of the battle, Milne Force comprised approximately 8,500 Australian soldiers from both the AIF and the militia, supported by RAAF squadrons and a contingent of American engineering troops who found themselves in a fight they had not been sent there to fight. The total Japanese force committed reached roughly 2,000 men at its height, including reinforcements beyond the initial landing. On paper, those figures can look comfortable for the defenders, but Milne Bay's terrain and weather made paper calculations dishonest. Dense tropical jungle does not scale cleanly with numbers because sightlines collapse, movement slows, and control becomes local and fragile. Japan had been exploiting exactly that reality against Allied troops across the Pacific for months. At Milne Bay, the equation reversed completely, and the reversal left no room for ambiguity. On the Australian side, 373 soldiers were lost in action or later passed away from wounds sustained during the battle, and many more were wounded. These were militia and regulars alike, aircrew and ground crew, men from across Australia who ended up at the eastern tip of New Guinea in the late summer of 1942 and paid for that ground with their futures. In a place where the jungle behaved like a third enemy, the toll was not abstract and it was not small. Now add the weather because it is not background, but it is evidence. Milne Bay is one of the wettest places in the Pacific region, with annual rainfall exceeding 250 centimeters, and during the battle, rain was essentially constant. Tracks became rivers of mud, vehicle movement became near impossible, and supply runs that would be routine elsewhere became dangerous, exhausting slogs that ate hours and men. Those conditions punish the attacker harder than the defender because the attacker needs momentum and clean logistics, and Milne Bay shredded both simultaneously. And in that weather, the RAAF contribution carried a sharp edge that deserved a far louder story of its own. The 75th and 77th Squadrons flew Kitty Hawk fighters and fighter bombers from the very airstrips Japan came to seize day after day in conditions that made flying genuinely dangerous. Those missions struck supply lines, hit troops in the open, and disrupted reinforcement at the critical moment when the Japanese landing force needed every advantage it could find. Japan did not plan for any of it. Japanese planners had been told the airstrips were not yet operational, and that assumption sat at the center of their entire timetable. The airstrips were operational, the aircraft were fueled, the pilots were ready. That single intelligence failure helped break the entire operation, because a landing force pinned in mud and hunted from the air has nowhere left to go except back into the sea. So Milne Bay was everything a public should have wanted in a war story, and precisely what certain powerful men did not want emphasized. It was a clear victory in a year of fear. It was decisive proof that Japan's land forces could be beaten. It was an Australian achievement built from regulars, militia, and airmen working together under extraordinary pressure, without adequate resources, and without the confidence of their own high command. It was also a deeply awkward fact for any commander who had spent the battle planning institutional doubt or positioning himself against blame. A loudly celebrated Milne Bay would have raised immediate and uncomfortable questions about who was right before the battle and who was wrong, and powerful men with clean uniforms and direct lines to Washington are rarely enthusiastic about that kind of public arithmetic. That is why the fight for credit matters, even to people who claim they do not care about medals and headlines, because credit decides memory, and memory decides what a nation believes about itself. Milne Bay should have been a national declaration that the so-called Chocos did not melt, that Australians did not need permission to win, and that the jungle did not care what a headquarters had predicted. Instead, too many Australians carried a quiet and bitter knowledge that the official story was never quite the story they had lived. Milne Bay stayed in Allied hands. The Japanese plan to convert it into a forward base for the assault on Port Moresby was permanently ended. The war moved on to the next grind, the next island, the next line of jungle that had to be bled for before anyone further back thought it was worth marking on a map. The men who fought there went back to other fronts, back to hospitals, back to the long years of waiting for the world to understand what they had done and say it plainly. They did not get a perfect ending because wars do not issue those, and neither do headquarters that fear embarrassment. What they got was the fact itself, stubborn and indestructible. In the rain and mud of Milne Bay, Australian soldiers and Australian airmen cracked the myth that had been strangling Allied confidence across the Pacific, and history still owes that truth its full volume.